This section we're going to talk about those same trig ratios, but finding the side lengths in relation to them. In addition to being able to solve for angles, we have to solve for side lengths. In order to do this, we need to know how to manipulate an equation. For example, if 5 equaled x divided by 3, there's two solid methods to be able to do this. The first one is probably the most basic. Because it's x divided by 3, the opposite of divided by 3 will be 2 multiplied by 3, which means the multiplication and division will cancel off, and we'd have x equal to 15. The other solid method is to treat this with the fact that 5 is still a fraction, which means that we can do our cross multiplication. We can multiply 1 by x to give us x, and we can multiply 5 by 3 to give us 15. So both of those are solid methods, and you have to just choose your own specific method. If we have 5 equaling 3 divided by a number, again, there's two methods we can do it. We could do it as the strict solving the equation situation, which means that we want to get rid of our division, which means we would want to multiply both sides by an x, leaving us with a 5x on the left-hand side, and our x canceling off to be left with a 3 on the right-hand side. Then our final step will be to get the x by itself by dividing by the 5, and our x value would be 3/5. Another perfectly viable way of solving a situation like this is to use that same cross multiplication as we had done over here. 5 being the same as 5 over 1. 1 times 3 is 3. 5 multiplied by x is a 5x. And finish off by dividing both sides by a 5. Meaning 5's cancel off. And our x value is still alone. It still equals 3/5. For me, it doesn't matter which kind of method you use. Cross multiplication absolutely is a fantastic way to be able to do it. At the same time, I know that when I was learning it, I did it all by strict calculation, just strict manipulation. Cross multiplication is for sure a good method. If you have to go just by strict manipulation, go for it. So in an example here, we're going to solve for the side AB. Well, we want to be able to identify our sides. In relation to our triangle, our side X, or our side AB, is our hypotenuse. Whereas the other known side that we have is the adjacent, which means what we're going to have to do is set up our ratio. The only ratio, and I'll write that up here, the only ratio that uses the adjacent and the hypotenuse is the cosine ratio, which means the cosine of our angle. Now in this case, we actually have an angle. We have an angle of 37 degrees. You don't necessarily have to write the degrees because as long as your calculator's in degrees, you don't have to include units in your question. But our equation does do our adjacent divided by our hypotenuse, which in this case is x. There are the two methods. We can do it by cross multiplication, which means we have cosine of 37 all over 1. It's going to give us the same kind of understanding. I'll show this one by the strict manipulation, and the next time that we see a situation like this, I'll show it by the cross multiplication. So multiplying both sides by the x allows us to cancel that off and we'd have our x multiplied by the cosine of 37. It would equal 11. Now to get the x by itself, this entire cosine of 37 is all one thing. We're not trying to get rid of the cosine, we want to get the x by itself, which means we're going to divide by the cosine of 37. Meaning our x value would equal 11 divided by the cosine of 37, leaving us with a final answer. Usually, as I go through things, I like rounding to the nearest tenth. 11 divided by the cosine of 37 comes out as 13.8. And we don't have a unit, so what we can usually say is it's however many units. In a question like this, you wouldn't be required to specifically put units, but it's a good practice to make sure you don't forget it. In the next question, in relation to our angle, our unknown side is our opposite side. Our known side is the adjacent. The only ratio that uses the adjacent and the opposite, more specifically opposite and adjacent, is our tangent ratio. So our tangent of 32 does equal our opposite side divided by the adjacent side. This one doesn't necessarily matter whether you solve it by a cross multiplication or by the manipulation or by the strict equation manipulation, because it's going to give us the exact same amount of steps. We do it by cross multiplication. 1 times x is x, which means our x is all by itself. My favorite method is just multiply both sides by 13, meaning that we're going to still have x equal our 13 multiplied by the tangent of 32. So x would equal 13 multiplied by the tangent of 32. And making sure I'm in degrees, just like I mentioned in the first section, I get 8.1 units. Personally, I expect that you're showing exactly what you have typed in your calculator. And this is exactly what I would type in my calculator. You have a function first calculator, you'd be typing something slightly different, but this is the proper way that it is written. You have a function first, I do recommend that you trash it. All right. Examples here. So in relation to our angle, this is our opposite side. Therefore, this would be our adjacent side. Our actual known side is our hypotenuse. The ratio that uses the opposite and the hypotenuse is our sine ratio. So we would take the sine of 37 equaling our opposite side, in this case it's x, divided by our hypotenuse. In order to manipulate this equation, we just multiply both sides by 10.3. For the simple fact that 10.3 in the denominator and 10.3 in the numerator would cancel off. To divide and multiply are opposite operations, and they would cancel each other off. So x would equal 10.3 multiplied by the sine of 37. X would equal sine of 37. 6.2 units. And our last example, let's see, that is our hypotenuse. In relation to the angle that we have, this would be our opposite side. This would be our adjacent. The ratio that uses opposite and hypotenuse is once again our sine ratio. So the sine of 57 would equal our opposite side, which is 10.8, divided by our hypotenuse, which is x. Now I had made the mention that over here I did it by the strict calculation, by the strict manipulation. I'll show this one by the cross multiplication. So anything can be that same thing over 1, which means if I take a 1 and multiply by 10.8, I'm going to be left with 10.8. If I take a sine 57 multiplied by x, by force of habit, I put my x in front, but it's still being multiplied by the sine of 57 in order to get the x by itself. I divide both sides by the sine of 57. Meaning x would equal the sine of 57 divided by, oh, sorry, I'm looking at the other side, wrong side. 10.8 divided by the sine of 57. And as I type that into my calculator, 10.8 divided by the sine of 57, we get 12.9 units. Now units can always be abbreviated down to just U, or in this case, because there's nothing actually stated, technically 12.9 would be acceptable, but I know that a lot of my questions do actually have units. Like these examples. A nursery plants a new tree and attaches a guy wire to help support the tree while its roots take hold. An 8-foot wire is attached to the tree and to a stake in the ground. From the stake in the ground, the angle of elevation to the connection in the tree is, with the tree, is 42 degrees. Find, to the nearest tenth of a foot, the height of the connection point on the tree. Now we have the diagram and it's all labeled in here. So what we want to do is identify our sides. In relation to our angle, this would be that would be the opposite. And because this side is directly across from the right angle, that would be our hypotenuse. So we're going to use our sine ratio again. The sine of 42 would equal our opposite side, which is x, divided by our hypotenuse, which is 8. Quick manipulation. Multiply both sides by 8. And x would equal 8 multiplied by the sine of 42. When you type that into your calculator, to the nearest tenth of a foot will be 5.4. Now our unit is feet. Perfectly acceptable to use the apostrophe, though if you use the double apostrophe, you are going to have an incorrect answer because that is inches. I expect that you're showing your manipulation, showing what you have typed in your calculator, and obviously you're going to have your answer. It's how you get full marks with me. Our last example is that from the top of fire tower, forest ranger sees his partner on the ground at an angle of depression of 40 degrees. If the tower is 45 feet in height, how far is a partner from the base of the tower to the nearest tenth of a foot? Well, here's a few great things. if this is a 40-degree angle, and an angle depression is always measured from a horizontal going down, we can identify that this is also 45 feet. And by properties of rectangles, because we have actually created a rectangle here, that would also be x. So in relation to our angle, the 45 feet will be the opposite side, and the x, because it's directly attached, but it is not across from the right angle, this would be our adjacent side. The ratio that uses the opposite and the adjacent is the tangent ratio. So our tangent of 40 will equal our opposite, which is 45, divided by our adjacent, which is x. And whether you solve it by cross multiplication or you solve it by strict manipulation, I know that many people are going to be more comfortable with cross multiplication, so I'll show that one again. I can multiply, or sorry, I was showing by cross multiplication, sorry. 1 multiplied by 45 is 45. X multiplied by the tan of 40 is x multiplied by the tangent of 40. We can then divide by the tangent of 40 on both sides. And that's all going to cancel off. We're going to be left with x equaling the tangent of 40, and denominator, sorry, I'm doing that again. Looking at the wrong side. 45 divided by the tangent of 40. And this side is exactly what I'm going to type to my calculator. 45 divided by the tangent of 40 gives us green 53.6 feet. That's our unit. I know for a fact that this question could have been solved slightly differently, but our answer would have still come out the same. For example, we could use the property that, yes, this is going to be a right angle, which means if this is 40, its complement would be 50, and we could continue from there, making that we'd still be using the tangent ratio, but we'd have x over 45 instead, while using the 50-degree angle. So that's another way that can be done, but our answer is still going to be the same. Now you can go have fun.